Hi friends, my name is Leonie. It is a very rainy day. Just the whole day has been rainy, so I thought this is the perfect time to just cozy up and talk about the books that I read in the month of August, and then I will also talk a little bit about the books that I plan on reading in September. So the past month has been a very typical Leonie month because I only read fantasy and non-fiction. So the two types of books that I enjoy reading the most. I really hope that next month I can bring a little bit more variety in the types of books that I read. But alas, I had fun and I had a very quality reading month, just reading the stuff that I love. I think I ended up reading 5 books, including 1 audiobook. I didn't really read many audiobooks. Usually I read like at least 3 audiobooks in a month, but this time I was just really not feeling it and I only read 1. But we'll get there. Let's just begin with the first book. The first book that I read this month, and this is one that I've promised I would talk about since last month, and that is that I finally read this... I finally read The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. Last month I raved about the 5th season and the Obelisk Gate, and just like a few days later I finally finished The Stone Sky, which is the last book in the Broken Earth trilogy. This is like a science fiction fantasy crossover novel. Imagine a fantasy world where once every few hundred years the Earth just kind of goes crazy and has like volcanic eruptions and hurricanes and just it feels like the end of the world. That is called a 5th season that lasts for dozens of years, and humans kind of have to survive through that, and it happens quite often. And in the beginning of this book a new 5th season starts, and we follow these 3 perspectives of people that are kind of navigating in this world, what it means in this world to have magical abilities, which the people in this world can create earthquakes, which is really cool. And having read the entire trilogy now, you can really see just the themes that are used in this series. Like, it's a very theme-heavy series, which I very much enjoyed. It really goes into parenthood. It's very heavy on the topic of discrimination and oppression, falsification of history, extractivism, lots of things. I think you should definitely read this trilogy if you are in the mood for a fantasy that's just completely unlike anything other that you've read, that will blow your mind, that will make you think, and that you just get thrown into and you can just like spend your time trying to solve the mystery of this world. Anyway, I've just been talking about the trilogy. Of course I have to give my opinion on the last book. The best one was, in my opinion, the 5th season. Then the Obelisk Gate was like 3.5 stars, and then this one was 4 stars again. This is the book in which we really get all the answers to our questions, and I loved reading all the flashbacks where we get these answers, to the point that sometimes the current timeline plot I found a little bit less interesting, but overall a great solution to the trilogy that really combined everything that was so great about the trilogy so far. So yes, read this trilogy. I don't know how often I still have to say this, but please read this trilogy, it's so good. The next book that I read I actually don't have with me because I already lent it out to a friend, which is a very good sign, I think. But that is The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. This is a non-fiction book that is basically just a summary of all the things that could possibly go wrong if we don't do anything about climate change. It's really good at just kind of bluntly telling you everything that could go wrong, but not in a way that feels very alarmist. It's written in just the right way that it makes you want to do something, but not like too much that you just kind of lose all hope and kind of become beaten down and you don't even want to try anymore. That's a very fine line to walk when we talk about climate change, so I think that book did a really good job at that. I'm gonna go into it more in my climate change book vlog video, where I can like share some of the information that I read in this book. I understand that sometimes you can think, oh, I already know what's gonna go wrong with climate change, or I don't want to spend like a whole book on it because, you know, I'd rather spend my time doing something more fun. But this book, trust me, like, you will have like a new view, a new way of looking at exactly what the problems are. Like, you probably already know a lot of things that's mentioned in this book, but this fills in those gaps in a way that it suddenly all comes together in your head and you're suddenly like, oh shit, now that I see this all together, I have a way better view of what's actually going on and what we should actually do about this. And it's a pretty quick and digestible book, so I highly recommend this. If you actually, there's no if, I would recommend this to everyone. It's just something that I think everyone should know. Then, the next book that I read this month, you may have already seen the reading vlog of this, but I finally finished The Priory of the Orange Tree. Yes, that book that I have been meaning to read for about 4 months now. I finally got around to finishing this 800-page adult fantasy. This is a retelling of George and the Dragon. It's basically just this grand epic fantasy about all these different countries and how they deal with the fact that the dragons are going to wake up again. And if they wake up, you know, they could kill everyone and it could cause so many wars, and it's just not really a great thing. This was a ride. I have very mixed opinions on this book. Let me just start out by saying that I loved the world building. It's very extensive. There are so many places, characters, different cultures, different religions, and I really just appreciate how much thought Samantha Shannon put into that. I really liked seeing this difference between the east of this world and the west of this world, and how these different cultures looked at dragons in different ways. You know how in the east they are kind of seen as more friendly and they mostly live in the water, whereas in the west they're kind of seen as the enemy and they're more dangerous and they don't live happily with the people. But I will say that I am personally more a fan of fantasy books that are kind of more of a smaller scope. This is really like an epic, large scope fantasy. So if that's your thing, I think you're gonna love this, but it's just not really my favorite thing. Also, I tend to not really enjoy it if the villain of the book, which in this book you very quickly find out the villain is basically the dragons. When the villain is, I'm sure there's like a correct word for this trope, but I always call it impending doom trope, where the villain is pretty much absent for the entire book. But the whole thing is, ooh, you know, they might come soon, like they might wake up soon, like what if they come? Ooh, but as a reader, you know that they're probably only gonna come at the end, and then you know they're probably gonna come somewhere in the middle of the book just to show up and show you, the reader, that they are indeed very dangerous, and then they're gonna disappear again until the climax. That's what this book has, where the villain is like absent, but they're constantly talked about, but you don't actually see them actively engaging with the main character throughout the book. And that's just like a personal choice, but I like my villains to be active and constantly interacting with the protagonists, so that there's some more back and forth between these characters, you know, them influencing each other, influencing each other's character arcs. I like that a bit more, and that wasn't possible with this fantasy, where it was basically just like, ooh, big dragon might come soon. Also, this book is very heavy on the political intrigue, which again is just not really my thing. It's just a personal preference. And I've been trying to figure out why I couldn't really connect to these characters, because there was basically one out of the 4 characters named Ede that I really enjoyed and I really loved reading about them. The other ones, I did not care. I tried to figure out why that was, and I think it's because these characters are mostly just talking about the plot. Like, whenever the characters have conversations with each other, they are talking about things that are happening in the plot. They're talking about the politics, they're talking about the dragons, they're talking about other characters, but they rarely talk about themselves. They rarely have like dialogues where they, you know, are vulnerable, or they have like a character moment. And I think that's what kept me from getting attached to these characters. It's really more of a plot-driven book. But back to things that I did really enjoy. It's super action-packed. It has a sapphic relationship at its center, which I really enjoyed. That's kind of the theme running through this story, about how women are often erased from fantasy. I really appreciated that. So in the end, I gave this one 3 stars. I enjoyed it, mostly all the action scenes and the world building and the romance, but other than that, didn't blow me away. I've been talking forever already. I'm very sorry. But the next book that I read was for our book club, the World Readers Book Club, and that is The Poppy War by R. Huang. This is another adult fantasy. See, as I've been saying, I've been reading a lot of fantasy. This one is about a girl named Rin who enters this academy, military academy that's super prestigious, where she has to train really hard to become a good soldier. Follow her through her training, but there's this threat of a possible third poppy war breaking out that could wreak havoc in the country. This is grimdark fantasy, so definitely check the trigger warnings if you want to read this. Like, there are some scenes in here that I stupidly read before going to bed, and that really did not make me happy, and I had to watch some YouTube videos to make me happy again before going to sleep, because otherwise I would definitely have nightmares. Not, you know, dark and gruesome just for the sake of being dark and gruesome. What the author set out to do is to show how cruel and horrible war actually is, because it's often very glorified in fantasy, and I really appreciated that. Also, what I really liked were the characters. This book does such a good job that despite the fact that we're only seeing from the perspective of our main character Rin, all the other characters still shine so much, and they're so well developed, and just there are just a few characters in here that I'm like, new favorite characters, quirky mentors, sign me up. Another thing that this book did fantastic, yes, there are just a lot of things that this book did fantastic, is the action scenes. First of all, there are many of them, and second of all, they were just so clear. It does happen quite often that when I'm reading an action scene that I'm like, okay, yeah, okay, so they're fighting, I can't really follow what's happening exactly, but I trust you, okay, they're fighting. With this one, I could just see it all. I could just see it all in front of me, playing out like a movie, just very well done. Only bits of criticism that I have of this book is that I wasn't a huge fan of the writing style. It's very basic and straightforward. It's not that I need like very overly flowery writing, it's just that this writing was kind of like a little bit too dry for me. And personally, I thought the book kind of slacked somewhere in the middle. Like, there's two parts of this book. You may have heard, like, in a discussion around this book, most people love part 1 or part 2 because there's such a big shift between them, and I personally liked part 1 more, with like all the training sequences, because I love training sequences. And then at the beginning of part 1 I was kind of like, it's a little boring. Oh, by the way, that also happened to be the part where there was more like political intrigue, which again, I'm just not a big fan of. I'm not really sure why, because I do enjoy political critique or societal critique in books. Like, I really enjoyed what this book is trying to say about war in general, but then as soon as it starts being about like the politics within the book, I kind of stopped caring. So that wasn't really my thing. But overall, great book. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I'm a little apprehensive about the second book because I heard that that one's even heavier on the political intrigue, so that doesn't really make me very excited about it. If you want to see full spoiler thoughts on this book, I have a live show up on my channel, The Book Club with Sabine and Meg, so I will link that on the screen or in the description. Alright, and then we are coming to the last book that I read this month, and that is The Courage to Be Disliked. Okay, so I feel like I'm going to talk about this book for a long time because there's a lot to say. This book has, if you go on Goodreads, like 5-star ratings and then 1-star ratings. Like, people either absolutely love it or they just despise it. And I think I understand why, so let me just explain to you what this is. This is a non-fiction book about... how do you say? It's basically just an explanation of Adlerian psychology, which Adler was like one of these psychologists from like the big trinity of, you know, like Freud and Jung, and then you had Adler, who was not often spoken about, and this book kind of explains his psychology and basically how you can use that psychology to be happy and how to not feel bad about yourself, you know, by having the courage to be disliked. Actually, it's kind of a misleading title because it's not about that much. It's like a small part of the book. I would mostly say this is about how to get rid of the idea that you're inferior or feeling like you're not good enough. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The way that this book is set up, I really enjoyed. It's like a conversation between a philosopher, an old man, and this young man that kind of sets out to debunk all his ideas, but like through this long conversation he is eventually, of course, persuaded by the philosopher to live his life according to Adlerian psychology. And I really enjoyed the setup, especially I would highly recommend the audiobook because the voice acting is great and it really feels like you're listening to just a conversation between two people, as if it was like a podcast that was like recorded 200 years ago. So let me start out by saying, don't read this book and think, ooh, this is the psychology, this is it, this is the one thing that I'm gonna believe now, because the whole thing with psychology is that there are so many theories, especially if you're gonna look at these older dudes. But I do think it can be very useful to just look at it and see what you can learn from it and which bits and pieces you can kind of use in your own life as just kind of like little nuggets of life advice. I'll soon get into like the little things that I mostly got out of this book because I think it will be fun to share that. But let's just talk about why so many people hate this book. A lot of people hate this book and say that it's like an insult to modern psychology, and it basically comes down to the fact that one of the major ideas of Adlerian psychology that is mentioned at the beginning of this book is that trauma isn't real and that you're not influenced by trauma but by other things. You know how Freud was always like trauma, everything's trauma. Adler was like, no, actually trauma doesn't exist at all. And I understand that a lot of people read that and were like, yeah, maybe don't say that to people who have experienced trauma. What I know from like the psychology classes that I've taken and my master's in neurobiology that I'm doing right now, trauma is definitely real. Like it definitely has a great influence on not just your mind, but also just your body and even your DNA. So the idea that trauma isn't real, I wouldn't necessarily believe that. But the thing about this book is that after that, it's not even about that anymore. The majority of this book is not really about the idea that trauma isn't real, or at least I personally could get a lot out of it, even just ignoring that part. And to all the people that have said that this is like an insult to modern psychology, I kind of looked into it, and it appears that Adlerian philosophy, I keep saying philosophy, but it's psychology, it's just that one of the characters in the book is a philosopher, but Adlerian psychology has actually been a major influence on modern cognitive behavioral therapy and just like general psychology. So I think that does mean that his other ideas can definitely be taken seriously. How I look at it is you can kind of spin it in this positive way, that it's mostly about you're not defined by your past and you can change by changing the way you look at life and changing your thoughts, which I think is kind of vital to modern psychology as well, because the whole point of like therapy is that you are not forever defined by what happened in your past, but you can actually change. I don't know if anyone's still watching this video at this point, but now I just kind of want to go into the things that I mostly learned from this book that I thought were the most interesting. Is anyone else like interested in these kind of topics? Because I'm really interested in kind of like personal development that takes influence from psychology and philosophy. I think that's pretty cool. So I always like to write down the little things that I learn. I really like that this book goes a lot into feelings of inferiority and how we should get rid of this idea that life is like a competition with winners and losers, and that a lot of problems in our lives basically arise from the idea that we see like the people around us as our competitors, when we really shouldn't do that and just see them as like our friends and our equals. And it's kind of common sense, but I do think a lot of us just kind of forget it often as well. So this is one thing that I think kind of like blew my mind the most, and that is that you shouldn't praise people or punish people, but mostly like that even praising people can be bad, because it says being praised reminds you that you have no ability. And at first I was like, that doesn't make sense. But then it explained, like, if you rely on praise and you know, praise from others makes you happy, then it means that you are living according to the standards of others, because that's the only way that praise could make you feel good, if you actually live according to the standards of this other person. And therefore it reminds you of the fact that you are dependent on them to see yourself as having ability when you shouldn't. So that's why getting praise reminds you of how you yourself don't have any ability. And I was like, dang, didn't think of that, but that's a good point. If you praise people, you kind of put yourself above or below others. You kind of create this hierarchy, and it's actually better if you, like, you know, thank people for the things that they do. You kind of just make a statement on the thing that they did, but you don't put like your own value system onto them. And then the other one that I really liked was accept yourself not on your acts, but on your being. So you're not defined by the things you do, but by who you are. Like the fact that you exist already gives you value. Anyway, I would recommend this book on audio, and I would recommend it if you're someone who's kind of struggling with like feelings of inferiority, if you often feel like you're not good enough, then I really think this book can at least like spark some thoughts and make you think about certain things. Again, I wouldn't like take everything that is said in this book and just take it for truth. Like there are a lot of things that I was like, don't really agree with that, but also a lot of things that I'm like, I do think I'm gonna use that in my life. And I think I ended up giving it like 3 stars. Anyway, that was the books that I read this month. In case anyone's still watching after that rant on that book, I will now share the books that I want to read next month, just very quickly. First, this is a book that I already showed in my birthday haul, but I want to read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It's getting really dark in here, by the way. I hope it's just a vibe. But this is a book by a psychiatrist who survived the Second World War in Auschwitz, and it is about how he developed his psychology, his therapy, what he learned in that experience, and it's about how people, even in the most barren circumstances, can still find meaning. I heard a lot of fantastic things about this, so I'm really excited to get into this, and I really think this is going to be one of those books that you're just gonna learn so much from, and it's really going to change the way you look at life. So I'm really excited to talk about this one next month. And then the other book that I'm going to read is really pretty. It is Star Daughter by Shweta Takrar, and this is a YA fantasy or YA urban fantasy about a girl who is half star, which I think is pretty cool. She kind of is dealing with some family troubles. She just lives in New York, and she's taken up to the celestial plane, and she has to enter this magical competition, which sounds really cool because you guys know how I feel about magical competitions. I'm really excited to just dive into a YA fantasy because it's been a long time since I've like physically read a YA fantasy. I think the last time was The Shadows Between Us, and we all know what I thought of that book. Alright, so that was all that I wanted to talk about today. Let me know if you've also read any of these books and share your thoughts on them in the comments. If you like this video, you can give it a like, or you can subscribe if you enjoy my videos and want to see more. If you want to follow me on social media, you can at @thebookleo, and I hope to see you soon in another video really soon. Goodbye!